Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. It's such a lovely day. So I very much appreciate that you want to hear a little bit about my research and what I do. And thank you also to my students. Some of you are here, so thank you for being here. This is going to be different from what we talked about in the classroom. So the title of my presentation is Global and Critical Approaches to Public Relations, Theoretical Insights from Latin America. Just to introduce about who I am as a scholar, I just want to tell you a little bit about the focus of my research, which lies at the intersection of critical branding, Latin American studies, and public relations. So here at the UCOM, I'm an assistant professor of public relations. However, I do incorporate some of that literature coming from critical branding and just examining branding from a critical perspective, understanding this idea that everything now can be branded or commodified through something like a brand, right? And then how nowadays that applies to the branding of countries, right? So that's where I use some of the Latin American studies literature, because what I do in my research is nation branding in Latin America. A little bit of an of a definition of nation branding and what is nation branding. I very much like this definition that says that nation branding is the compendium of discourses and practices aimed at reconstituting nationhood through marketing and branding paradigms. So the reason why I like this definition is because it really brings this idea of nationhood or national identity or national identities and how they all can be branded, right? And how we can use marketing and branding paradigms to, again, brand a country, right? Or brand the identity of the country or identities of the country, right? So in the context of Latin America, these are just some of the brands that have been launched in the past 15 years or so. All of them have very different approaches to why they do nation branding in the first place. So for example, this brand from Haiti was launched in 2018, and it had the specific focus of attracting investment to the country. So thinking about Haiti and one of the poorest countries in the region and also the world, they created this brand to attract investment, right? Which is very different from the approach of countries like Mexico or Brazil. And their brands have been more on the tourism side and then bringing capital, bringing revenue to attract tourism, right? So again, these are just a few of the examples. Nation branding's main goals are to attract tourism, investment, and exports. So when we think about exports, we think about, for example, Chilean wine. So this is the brand of Chile. Argentina has done the same branding, for example, wine, or Colombia has done the same with branding coffee or different products, right? So those are examples of exports. And then the tourism very much explains itself, and then the investment is basically attracting capital from international companies that want to establish their businesses in different countries throughout the region to explore mining opportunities or agricultural opportunities, etc. And those are the main reasons why these countries within the region do nation branding, right? So it has a strong economic development focus. That's the most important thing for us to keep in mind in the first place, right? There are different theoretical approaches to PR and nation branding. So if I can just ask, if you could just raise your hand, who here are PR majors? Okay, great, awesome. So if we think about research in public relations, there are many different approaches to study PR, right? I use the definition of Lee Edwards, a scholar at London School of Economics in the UK, and she proposes there are two main approaches to study and practice PR. One is the functional approach, which is focused on how do we make PR campaigns more effective, how do we reach publics more effectively, how do we support the organization's bottom line. And then the other approach is the sociocultural approach, which explores issues of power and representation, and then how brands are and organizations are also interconnected through society and those relationships and how they evolve, right? So it's more of a, there are two different approaches to PR, basically. And then when we look at nation branding, something very similar happens. And I use here the definition of a scholar, Nadia Kaneva, at the University of Denver, and she's an expert on nation branding. And she proposed that there are three approaches to study nation branding, one being the technical economic, the other the political, and then the third one the cultural approach to nation branding. The technical economic and the political approach are very much this idea that we can use PR, that we can use marketing, that we can use branding to attract more investment offerings or attract tourists or promote exports, right? The political approach is how presidents or governments within the region use nation branding or their country's reputation to politically attract more people and just improve their soft power or their image internationally, right? And then the cultural approach, which is the third one, is very similar to the sociocultural approach proposed by Edwards, looking at issues of power and looking at the imbalance of the identities and cultures that are portrayed through these brands, right? So I guess this chart here can help us to maybe think about the different types of research questions that each approach asks, and then how they fall into either a PR or nation branding approach. So for example, if we're trying to think about what is the effectiveness of a nation branding campaign or a PR campaign, that would be something more along the lines that the functional approach to PR would answer. But then if we look at it from the nation branding perspective, that would be kind of like the technical, economic, or political approaches, right? So thinking about the effectiveness of how we, for example, if we are working on a nation branding project for Colombia or Mexico, how are we reaching publics more effectively? How are we getting more people to come to Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, whatever country that we're promoting, right? But then if we switch gears and go into this other type of research question of who has the power to decide the culture's identities that will represent an idea, right? So when we think about an idea from PR, that would be the sociocultural approach proposed by Edwards. But then from a nation branding approach, who has the power to decide the culture's identities that will represent a country? That would be a question that the cultural approach to nation branding would sort of answer, right? Is this clear so far? Yes? Cool, I'm getting some nod there, so I guess that's good. So what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to quickly present results from two studies that I've conducted these past few years. This one is already published. It was published last year at the International Journal of Communication. And then the second one is going to come out very soon at a journal called Communication, Cultural, and Critique. So this first study explores nation branding in Latin America and basically proposes the idea that nation branding is a form of modern colonialism, right? So a little bit about the history of Latin America. The region lived under colonialism until the 19th century, and that's where most of the countries gained their independence from Spain or Portugal. And even though and I say we because I am from Chile, so I do consider myself Latin American, there's still a very much colonial mindset within the region, right? Which translates into the dependency and particularly the economic dependency that countries within the region have in the promotion of tourism or export or investment, right? So there's a reason why countries within Latin America do nation branding in the first place, and that is because there is this dependency need. There's this economic dependency to attract capital, to attract revenue, to attract dollars, period. That's pretty much in a nutshell. So in this study, I used world systems theory, which is a theory coming from sociology, which proposes that within the world's economy, there are three types of countries. Countries that are at the core of the world's economy, countries that are at the semi-periphery, and countries that are in the periphery, right? So if we think about core nations are going to be developed nations, countries with advanced industries that manufacture products using high-level technologies. So just to ask a question, what do you think are examples of core nations? Just take a guess. The United States. Very good. What other countries? Germany. Yeah. Yeah, developed countries. Right. So China these days too could be an example of a poor nation when you look at it from an economic standpoint and the importance that they have to the world's economy. So that's what this theory proposes, right? These are countries that are very important to the world's economy, and those countries are the poor, right? In a way, they kind of rule the world's economy. They're very important. So for example, if you look at the news and then you see news from, I don't know, India these days, or Brazil, for example, or with, again, Brazil is an example of a semi-peripheral country, so maybe I should not have said that. But again, the United States, Western Europe countries, those are the types of countries that are going to be at the core, right? Within Latin America, there have been a few studies that explore this idea of what types of countries are the Latin American countries. And again, Brazil is an example of a semi-peripheral country, which is kind of like at the middle. It's not necessarily at the periphery, but it's not at the core either. And also Mexico. And the reason for that is because of their geographic size and their relative importance within Latin American economies and the region, right? But then all the other countries within Latin America could be considered countries that are peripheral, that are at the periphery, right? So peripheral countries sustain their economies with the export of commodities and raw materials, right? So for example, where I'm from, Chile, the mining industry in Chile is very, very important. However, copper, lithium, all these commodities are not necessarily high value, if that makes any sense. They are very important to then produce iPhones or computers or batteries or all these things that are produced at the core level, right? But they're not necessarily high value, if that makes any sense, right? And that's the main reason that's what this theory proposes, right? That there's this imbalance within the world's economy, right? So again, if you look at the main goals of nation branding in the Latin American aspect, we talk about the promotion of tourism, we talk about the promotion of exports, and then we talk about the promotion of foreign direct investment, right? Which are examples of why these countries at the periphery are trying to gain the attention of the poor nations, right? So this study, the one that I'm talking about, focuses on the case studies of 3 countries, which are Chile, Colombia, and Peru. These countries are good examples because they've launched nation branding campaigns within the past, I would say, 15 years, and I'll talk a little bit more about the history behind these campaigns in the next slide. But the main thing that they have in common is that all these brands have a strong focus on economic development, right? They're trying to develop their countries and promote their exports, tourism, and FDI opportunities abroad. FDI being foreign direct investment, right? And how is it that they've done this type of work? They've done it with the help of governments within these countries, plus multinational branding and advertising and communication agencies that tend to be based in countries like the United States, the UK, etc., right? So it's this kind of like collaborative work between governments and then these multinational branding agencies, which maybe you could be working for one day, right? That makes sense. And what has been the advice for them? The advice for governments, for the countries. The advice has been to create a nation brand the same way that you create a brand for a product, and then work on the product's identity. So maybe you've heard throughout some of your classes here that when you're thinking about an organization, when you're thinking about a brand, you want to think about the brand's identity. Who here has heard that? Right? And then brands tend to have identities, right? So maybe what would be the identity of Apple? Just to take a guess. What would you say would be the identity of Apple? Innovation, right? Right. Good, good. What other word comes to mind?
User-friendly software.
User-friendly software, right? Efficiency, maybe, right? So those types of words are at the core of the identity of Apple's brand, right? And then if we apply that insight to the branding of countries, the idea, the advice, the pitch has always been, what is your brand's identity? What is your country's identity? What is it that makes you different within this competitive landscape of Latin America, from which people tend to have a very homogeneous idea, right? What makes you different? What is so special about your country? And then how can we use that to make it more appealing, right? For tourism, for exports, etc., right? So that has been the insight. The three research questions are outlined here. I'm just going to explain them in lay terms, or at least I'll try. The first research question proposes what are the conceptions of modernity and development, specifically economic development, that drive this work for the professionals behind these nation branding campaigns, right? So what is their understanding of economic development? And then how does that translate into their nation branding work? That's the first research question. The second research question is, what are the conceptions of Chilean, Colombian, and Peruvian identities that nation branding professionals use to manage and improve a country's brand? Again, what is that identity? What is that insight? Let's use that. And I wanted to know what was their conception of the insight, the identity, right? And then the third research question is, in the context of the coloniality of power, which is a concept that I'll explain at the end, how do nation branding campaigns account for the contested notions of what entails a country's culture and identity that is represented through each brand, right? So this is more about the power imbalances, and then how those power imbalances of what are the different identities or diverse cultures that conform a nation's identity are maybe represented or ignored through these brands, right? So a little bit of context on these three countries. Chile started their nation branding efforts in 2005. It had a strong focus on investment, on tourism, and on exports, but also the insight for them for that campaign, the one that you see here, Always Surprising, which is a terrible tagline, was that we're doing this, and when I say we, because again, I'm Chilean, because we want to promote our brand to foreigners, right? We're doing this in Chile, Always Surprising, because we want to promote internationally Chile. Maybe people in the US, maybe people in China, maybe people in Europe, right? That was the focus. It was always external, right? And maybe you've heard also in classes that when you're working on your brand identity of, again, Apple, again, you want that there's some sort of alignment between the identity, the internal and the external, right? So if we think about management of brands, right? You want to make sure that there's like certain cohesiveness between what is happening internally with the brand with what is being projected externally, right? What they did in Chile was that they only focused on the external brand, not really taking into consideration internally how that was going to be adopted by Chileans, right? Or their understanding of what we were doing nation branding in the first place. That brand from 2005 had the support of a branding agency called Interbrand. And then in 2013, they changed their strategy into this new logo, supported by the inside of Future Brand, which is another branding agency. You can actually look them up. Maybe there's going to be an internship or something that you can do for them in the future, if you're into brand. Just saying. Then on the other side here, we have Colombia. So Colombia in 2004 launched this branding campaign called Colombia is Passion. The focus of that brand was only tourism. It was mostly tourism. And what's different about this brand is that unlike the Chilean case, they promoted this brand both externally and also internally. And when I say internally, I mean among Colombians, right? So within the 1990s, maybe you all are too young to remember this, but who kind of has an idea of what happened in Colombia in the 1990s? Maybe you don't know, and that's fine. You can just say, I don't know. All right.
Pablo Escobar.
Have you seen Narcos? Netflix? There's a little bit of history there. I've heard it's like that's a washed version of it. Huh? So they had a lot of, the reputation of Colombia was very tainted by the image of Pablo Escobar, who was a big cartel drug dealer, right? So basically their reputation as a country was very damaged because of that, right? Because of that internal conflict that happened with the drug issues that started in the 80s, 90s, and a little bit to the 2000s as well. So this brand, Colombia's Passion, had a dual intent in a way. It was going to be promoted internationally, thinking about the Colombia's Passion, and we want to bring in tourism, and we want to promote this exotic idea of Colombia, and that it's fun to be here. But also at the same time, Colombia's Passion really resonated internally within Colombians, because they were seeing that in a way, this brand represented a different narrative from what they were portrayed as internationally, right? Which goes all the way back to the history of drug cartels and drugs and etc., right? So it was a different type of narrative about the country, and it resonated really well. So in a way, the internal with the external sort of matched through this brand, right? But then in 2010, with a new government, this new brand was created, and it's the one that they use until today. But they completely ditched the patient inside, right? And I mean, it's a brand. It's not the same. It's not the same level of adoption that it had the other one, right? And then here in the middle, we have a country brand, Peru. So who here has an idea of Peru, or who has been to Peru, maybe? What's your idea of Peru?
A lot of biodiversity, and it's something jungle.
Okay.
A lot of culture.
Yeah. When you say culture, what type of culture are you thinking about?
A lot of tribes, a lot of natives.
Yeah. So that's very much the driving inside of the country, the nation brand of Peru, right? So they use their indigenous past. They use that sort of like colonial heritage into their brand, right? So being really proud of their, again, indigenous past, of Machu Picchu, of all the different things that make Peru so unique, right, within the region, right? And also this brand, Peru, kind of like the Colombia's fashion brand, was very well adopted among Peruvians. So, and it was launched in 2011, which was also a period of time that Peru was growing a lot economically, and they were kind of like seeing the benefits of having a brand like this, that its main focus was to promote exports, tourism, investment, etc. To economically develop the country, right? So there are three big themes that I want to share here. The first one relates to the first research question, which was about the conceptions of economic development and modernity in Latin America. So the people behind these campaigns, and I have a slide later that I show you about, a little bit about their background, but it was 21 interviews with informants involved from the government side and also from the agency side in these campaigns. So they had a significant amount of experience with these different projects, right? So, according to their responses and their basically how they saw nation branding, they understood and they explained very early on that nation brands needed to promote exports, investment, and tourism opportunities. So it was very clear, we're doing this for economic development reasons, right? The second thing is that they all target similar markets to promote the nation brand, being the US, the UK, France, Germany, China, their main target audiences or target markets, right? So they wanted to get there because they saw that that's where the capital was, right? Either for mining, investment, or for agricultural products, or for tourism, etc. And this economic dependency, that again, translated into kind of like fighting for the same types of publics within these countries, put these countries in direct competition with one another at the regional level as well. So, for example, when Colombia was doing something, then Peru would be like, oh, they're doing this, maybe we should do the same because we want to target the same type of people. We want the same type of people to be interested in our brand, right? And then kind of like fighting this stereotype that all countries within Latin America are pretty much the same, right? So that's the first finding, which informs the second finding, that is that national identity was seen as a strategic asset for nation branding management, right? So this idea of the brand identity, which translated into the national identity, was used to work on brand image, right, on the nation brand, right? So that same type of language of branding of branding products was applied to the branding of countries. Some countries presented the nation brand internally to secure that buy-in, which happened with Peru and happened with Colombia as fashion. Again, that cohesiveness between the internal and the external. And this counsel, this advice, came from the multinational advertising agencies such as BBDO, Gray, Future Brand, following the same logic for when branding a private label. But only an appeal to national identity does not secure that buy-in, because who gets to decide what is the national identity of a country, right? something that we're going to talk about in a few more slides and also here. So what is true and what these informants sort of like reflected on was that nation branding was a reflection of a country's moment in history. So this idea of national identity, for example, in the Peruvian case, was used to instill feelings of pride, right? We should be proud of our colonial past or indigenous past or that heritage that sort of like defines us as a country. We should use that because that's what defines us and what defines what we are, right? However, nation brands are products of the economic, social, and political period in the history of a country. And some nation brands, kind of like the example of Peru and then also Colombia's fashion, can put a logo to that feeling, which could make people within a country to better embrace that brand. However, that internal presentation of the brand does not necessarily mean that people are going to feel that this is the country that best represents us or that says who we are in the better way. It's more about how the brand sort of like represents a moment in history, which could be informed by the economic development that that country is going through in that period of time, which happened in Peru in the early 2010s, and also for Colombia when they were trying to shy away from their past as a country for drugs, right? So bringing in a little bit of theory again, and thinking that nation branding is an expression of modern colonialism. This study conceptualizes nation branding as a venue for developing nations to know and learn the capitalism discourse of the Western world in the late stages of the 20th century. Oof, what does that mean? What does it mean? That is a venue, right? So for that, I use this model here, coming from the work of critical cultural scholars Walter Mignolo, he's an Argentinian, and also Aníbal Quijano, who's a Peruvian sociologist, so really using the work of scholars from the region. And they propose that there's this matrix that kind of like reflects the different ways in which countries within the region are dependent on, again, countries like the US or Western Europe or China these days, right? So on one of the edges is the economy aspect, right? And it's very clear that these countries are doing nation branding for economic development reasons, right? So that's pretty clear. And my study really does not contribute to that. I mean, it does kind of like confirm that finding, but it's not something new, right? But what I am proposing is that one of the other edges here on the matrix is the knowledge and subjectivity edge, which basically says, how is it that we know the things that we should be doing, right? Or how is it that we know ourselves, or that we kind of like, what is it that, basically, how is it that we know ourselves, right? And then thinking about nation branding and the language of branding as a discipline can be conceived as a venue to like know ourselves, right? So countries within the region have been doing nation branding because they need to sustain their economy, right? They need to foster economic development. But then why is it that they landed in branding in the first place? Basically because it's a trend coming from the global north, right? From the core nations, right? And then using this insight of branding and then insights such as like working on your brand identity and then how the brand identity informs your brand image. All that type of consult, all that type of advice is a way of knowing ourselves, which translates into a brand, in this case, a nation brand. So it's just a way to present to ourselves or our countries, these countries within this region of the world, to sustain economy and promote economy, right? So that's a little bit about the first study, and I'll be happy to answer some questions after I present this second study, which I promise is a little bit more digestible, I promise. So this second study is about what is it that it's been promoted in these nation branding campaigns, right? I wanted to know what is it, how are we as Latin Americans presenting ourselves to the eyes of the rest of the world through nation branding, right? How is it that we know ourselves and how we use that knowledge of ourselves into branding, using branding as a mechanism to, again, promote economic development. So for this, I use the work of Néstor García Cartini, again, an Argentinian critical cultural scholar. And he proposed that Latin American media and communication industries are vehicles for cultural expression that equalize national identities to reduce market-oriented discourses about the nation in a context of globalization. What does this mean? It means that most many industries within Latin America, media and communication industries, tend to fall into stereotypes about how is it that we are and how do we want to present ourselves to the rest of the world, right? And as my research suggests, the same situation can be applied to Latin American and Asian branding. So again, as I was saying, I wanted to know how is it that we're presenting ourselves through these ads or through these campaigns, right? So I conducted a qualitative content analysis of 72 video advertisements of 18 Latin American countries published to YouTube between 2010 and 2020. The videos had to be in English. They had to explicitly promote a country's exports, tourism, or investment offerings to foreign audiences, and they had to come from an official government organization or official nation branding organization, right? It's a qualitative study. It's a type of content analysis. And these are the two main themes that emerge from this study. The first one is this idea that there's an adventurous foreigner who goes to Latin America kind of like in a journey, right? Just to explore through his or her gaze, what is it that is so special about Latin America, right? And in here I present evidence from 3 countries, although if you're interested, I could show you for other countries as well and how they did this. So there's this main character featured in these ads. The main character tends to be a white man or woman traveling on their own or with a small group of friends, and then just exploring in a safe manner this exotic land or this exotic new place, right? So for example, the first images are from Costa Rica, and it has one of the ads from Costa Rica, and she says, and I'm just going to read here, what is it about a beautiful sunrise that energizes the body? That perfect cup of coffee that makes you feel strong and warm inside, or the sound of crashing water that reconnects you to the wonderment of nature. So in here you see things such as like that perfect cup of coffee. Coffee as a type of product that is promoted from Costa Rica to the world, like a type of export. Definitely promotion of tourism, definitely promotion of nature, which is maybe if you know a little bit about Costa Rica, is something that they've done very aggressively for the past 20 years or even more, kind of like promoting this idea that they're a green republic, right? And then how the tourists can go and be part of that experience, but it's through their lens. It's through the lens of the foreigner, right? The same happens with the case of Chile here. So again, this man goes to Chile. He goes to the Atacama Desert, which is a desert in Chile, also goes to Patagonia, he goes to try wine, he goes to the city, he meets people, but always the people who he meets with, like they're kind of like in the back, and he's the main character in the ad. And he explains that Chile isn't an easy place to define. It's hard to explain with words, maybe because there are just not enough. Chile has to be seen, felt, and heard. So there's this clear invitation from this man to go to Chile and explore it on your own, right? And then something, again, similar happens with Honduras, and he, the main character here, he goes to Honduras, he sees the very colorful birds, he explores the jungle, he goes on the zip line, he has all these kind of like adventurous experiences. And it's the ad is basically a representation of that, right? And then on the flip side, when we're talking about the locals who are featured on these ads, the story is a little bit different, right? So for example, here we have the case of Peru. Peru, as a country, again, very proud of their heritage, very proud of their indigenous communities and cultures, but then how they're using that to lure the attention of buyers, of tourists, and commodifying that insight, right? So for example, here in the ad, and I'll explain a little bit about the context when they say she is thousands, even millions of years old, and yet she is more alive than ever. She nurtures them, protects them, and above all, she feeds them. So when they're talking about she, they're talking about Mother Nature, and then how Mother Nature, or basically the territory of Peru, is a very fertile place for the production of potatoes, of avocados, of mangoes, that are later promoted for people like him to be consumed, right? So kind of like the locals are proud to have these heritage, and then how they're working in service of the tourist, the investor, the buyer, etc. Right? Something similar happened with El Salvador. So here, this ad is the main intention of this ad is to promote the tourism services industry as an investment industry again. So they're basically promoting that here in our land, referring to El Salvador, you will find incredible hosts, people who are born tenacious, generous, and proud of their country and their work. They look towards the future with only one goal, growing with you. They're promoting how the country is a very attractive place to go and invest in tourism, and then building these resorts that maybe you go on spring break or something like that, and then just like enjoy that experience, right? And then something very similar happened with Nicaragua, so promoting the labor force within the country, and then how that labor force can be used as an asset when you're trying to establish your business, for example, in Nicaragua, right? So those are kind of like the two themes that inform this research, which leads me to propose that nation branding is a self-stereotyping strategy, right? So all the campaigns that presented in the study presented the interaction between the foreigner and the local as separate, discrete entities, right? So there's not a lot of interaction, right? And then for the cases in which Latin America was not presented in an exotic way, it was depicted as a safe, strategic, and smart destination for foreign direct investment and global businesses, right? These ads, these campaigns, place the locals as foreign others, taking the gaze and perspective of the adventurous foreigner as normal, right? So basically, any questions about this study? Because I just ran into my last slide. So these two things, if we look about it, if we look at this from the perspective of nation branding as a modern expression of colonialism in the region, it's pretty much the same idea that applies in the representation of the cultures and identities through branding, right? So, which leads me to my final slide about who I am, and then how I look at this research from a sociocultural perspective. The sociocultural approach to public relations calls researchers to examine power imbalances that affect a subject under study, and then apply to the Latin American nation branding as a case study. This is examined when we question why countries engage in self-stereotyping strategies to lure audiences in the global world. So that's pretty much all I had to say about nation branding in Latin America. I just want to finish with one final comment. I understand that this type of work can be seen as very critical about branding, and then the use of advertising, of the use of PR, of the commodification of national identities and cultures. Maybe it makes you feel a little bad about yourselves. Maybe, I don't know. But I should say that before doing this type of research, before going to graduate school, I actually did this type of work professionally for the government of Chile. So that's kind of like what fueled my interest in this topic. I was doing nation branding for Chile, and I think that when I was doing that, and then also when I talked to the people that I interviewed, and then the people who I know that are in this business, they all have the best intentions about nation branding. We all, and I say, like, I was very excited doing this type of work. I thought it was like really cool and interesting. It made me feel very proud about like being Chilean and then doing this type of work. However, what I've learned from this research is that there's a whole architecture out there that's been kind of like laid out for us. And it's important to know how that architecture works, right? Which is a little bit about what we do in school through research, learning more about this. There are better ways to do nation branding. I'm not saying that this is only a criticism of what's been done, but I do this because I do think that there's a better way. So just putting that out there from from a more practical standpoint. That's all I have to say.
I have a question. We open it up for questions, but I get to ask first because I'm the oldest guy. Does that work? Okay. So here's something that all of you can think about for a second. So the idea of nation branding is a label for something that you explain very well in terms of it's a process by which a group of people decide what should the image be that is being portrayed about a particular country to people who are sometimes internal to that country because you're trying to create essentially a sense of cohesion, as well as to external for economic development, right? So this is actually, the label is nation branding. And the label of nation branding, as you very well pointed out, is associated with the core countries, right? So the core countries who are basically economically powerful and so on and so forth. But in my mind, all of this is a snapshot of the world that we exist in today. Let me tell you what I kept thinking. Before the Western world existed, when the old cultures existed, when Egypt existed, when India existed, when China, the old basically imperial China existed, they were using nation branding without using that term.
Right.
I mean, when people thought of India, they thought of spice. When they thought of China, they thought of actually what used to be called China in the Western world, which was all the porcelain.
Right.
So there were associations with these countries without even the Western, this is long before the Western world existed. So how do you explain that? How do you explain the fact that nation branding, although it's a label today, has always existed?
Yes.
So the Western world is not really doing anything new. They're
Right.
simply taking these things and systematizing them.
Right. That's right.
So what's the difference, I guess? In your mind, how do you see the difference between the two?
Yeah. I mean, I think, like, we've always known countries for something, right? And as you said, like, throughout history, people has known countries for anything, be a product, be whatever thing that comes to mind, right? I do think that the label of nation branding is relatively new in the sense that it's explained by economic globalization and then using branding as a modern term to then define how is it that we brand products, right? So it's more about this idea that the same way that you brand a product or an idea or service, these days, using the language of branding, if that makes any sense, can be applied to the branding of the countries, right? So it's more about how is it is a modern concept, but I agree that it's nothing new. It's just like the concept is new.
Yeah, the label is new.
Right.
But the concept of actually countries being associated with certain images inside our head have existed for thousands of years.
Well,
I was fascinated by the
I
fact.
think, Michael, though, the difference, though, in the idea of nation branding is it's the systematized use of ad and PR tactics by an organized body to promote a brand, right? Whereas what we're talking about, we used to think of India as spices and China as China,
Yeah.
that we don't know where it came from. It came from trade, rather than an organized way of using ad and PR tactics to promote a particular product. I think that's the differentiation. Would that be about accurate, Pablo?
Yeah. Yes.
It's a systematic use of ad and PR
Right.
tactics and campaigns to
Yeah.
promote the idea of a nation identity
Right.
surrounded by products.
Yes.
Sounds good to me. Any questions? You guys get to ask now. Now I would have asked my question.
I know that you said that you think there's some more effective ways to do nation building. What are some of your ideas for that?
Yes. I definitely think that, and the reason why I showed these slides, it's because I wanted to show you very clearly the way it's been done so far and how self-stereotyping can be damaging. I do think that it's that lack of interaction between cultures, right? And then how there can be learned experiences instead of like just the representation of discrete entities, right? So I will say that could be a better way. I also think that these are ads that tend to be short, like 30 seconds, maybe a minute and a half at the most, right? But in that sense, advertising, branding are limited. as well, right? So there are other ways of storytelling, and that's where maybe the power of PR or building relationships and then just working from there is more, I wouldn't say effective, but I feel like it would be more, it would be a better path, right? Just showing more of that interaction. For the qualitative content analysis? Yes. So it's a qualitative content analysis. So I started just by reading everything that was there. So I started with the 72 videos. I systemized them. I chose them using these categories, right, that are here. And then from there, I basically read the script from the campaign over and over again. I also looked at the images. I looked at the video, the sound, how all that played out in the ad. And then from there, you just start taking notes, right? It's not a quantitative content analysis that you already have kind of like categories laid out for you. The method that I use is coming from this book from Barry Grummet. It's the technique of close reading, which is basically being very systematic in just reading over and over again, engaging with that, taking notes, and then from those notes you start building categories, right? So it's inductive, not deductive. And then from that process you start seeing patterns or themes, and that's how you land into it.
So you mentioned that you have done this work in your prior career in Chile for the government,
Right.
So as you got into this work from a scholarly perspective, from a researcher perspective, were there things that surprised you about the world of nation branding vis-a-vis your experiences in the industry?
Yes, yes. So and I'm just gonna use this here. So I think when I came to graduate school, it was for my master's program and it was on strategic communication. And I very much wanted to explore this side of nation branding. Like I knew I had that experience coming from the government, like I want to do this type of work better, I want to know how do we do it, right? But I think just by learning and just by reading all the things about nation branding, it was like, it's actually more interesting to study why is it that we come to the same strategies over and over again, right? And then I think that surprised me, just seeing also that this is something that, even though this is from Latin America, is something that also applies to other regions of the world. And then they all, I mean, not all of them, but most of them tend to fall into the same self-stereotyping and then just using kind of like that quick idea about a country and then just using that when in reality there are better ways to do it. So I would say that surprised me. I wanted to be more of a, how do we make this work more effective, but then just learning about the power imbalances and the representation, that's what something that surprised me.
Do you think that nation branding can have any negative effects on like the local cities communities, or like would it be able to like could it potentially lead to certain countries being almost like too commercialized in a sense?
Yes, yes. So this is something that I don't know for a fact, but I think it could. But it's something that came from the interviews, particularly with Peru. So the representation of Peru is very clear, right? And it's about the indigenous communities and then how they live in the highest of the Andes in very rural areas, right? And you would think that most of the benefit of nation branding would go to them. However, the people doing this type of branding is mostly based in Lima, which is the capital of the country, which tends to be very connected to other centers of power globally, right? So in a way, again, I don't know for a fact, but it did come informally in some interviews, that questioning of we're using the images of these people. However, how much of that is actually going to them? I don't have data to show you like it's actually going or it's not going, but it is something that kind of like is there, that questioning of we're using these people, but in reality, how much of what we are doing goes to them. So I would say that would be like the best type of answer that I could provide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you can speak to this because I know it's like your overarching research question, but I guess just like an example in regards to like Columbia, like rebranding or like nation branding, how effective was it in terms of like time and just like effort to like shape the image they had previously had from like years prior?
Yeah. So I'm not gonna go back because I will have to go back. Well, maybe I can. Yeah. So this brand, as internally, was like again very effectively. This all came from my conversations with people from Colombia, and then also like just reading press stories, and then also from my own experience when I was doing nation branding myself, and then how they did their work. So I think this brand was very effective because of that internal feeling of pride of being Colombian. That's like this idea of passion. It's just something that really resonated with me. And then when they switched to this brand, it was because there was a change in government. So a new president came in, and then that new president thought that this image was very much associated with the image of the past president. So it was more of a political type of power thing. And that's how they landed into this. I will say that, again, in coming from my conversations with the people that I interviewed, your question was more about how they shied away from the stereotype? Was that kind of like the question?
Well, I was just like wondering how effective it was, but I guess kind of like now that you elaborated, like were there like negative effects from changing a second time? Like did that make people lose pride?
Yes, yes. So yeah, that's where I was going, because when they changed to this brand, people were still thinking about this other brand, and then kind of like how you change something so radically, and then your consumers are like, oh, but then I'm not sure that this was the right approach. And I mean, they've been very consistent. They still have these brands. It's 2023 now. It's been 13 years. This was only alive for 6, right? But then this was like very well adopted. And this one it's been okay, but it hasn't gained the same level of attachment that it got really won. I don't know why. But that's what happened.
One more. What would be the alternative to branding for economic development?
I don't think there's an alternative.
So the issue is actually making branding more representative of what the country is really like. What's the solution? I mean, you pointed out a problem. So what's the solution? What do you think is the solution?
You're putting me in a very difficult situation.
Let me do that. But that's good.
I don't have the answer.
Okay.
I will say that there are different, and like that's the other thing. There are little things that we can do as practitioners. I mean, I don't have the answer to that. But I do think that, again, going more on the interaction between the local and the foreigner, and then thinking about what we can learn from each other instead of like just the discrete entities and then how they're portrayed. That could be a venue for that. The other way could be about just making people internally understand the value of having a nation brand, because I do think that most people, from the experiences with these 3 countries specifically, they don't understand why is it there, why does it exist. People within, again, like for example from Chile, right? That brand has a strong focus on exports, on investment, on tourism, externally. But internally, there's been some conversation of what is it about Chile that we're seeing internationally. And there's been some, I would say, initial efforts to kind of like have those conversations that would create more of a shared idea of the different cultures and identities that should be used in these campaigns, which again, maybe, and it's never gonna be fully successful. Like there's not a magic wand, you know this very well. But I do think that those types of initiatives that at the internal level could open more space for conversation, or just like to see how we're being reflected in this brand, could be a little better, right? And again, I say little because it's little things that we can do.
Inclusivity, I mean, maybe including more
Yeah,
from
be more intentional
the
about it.
the widespread variation among the population
Right.
into helping create the image or something along those lines, making it
Facilitating the
more
space.
representative
Yeah.
of various aspects of the country.
Yeah.
Rather than something else.
Yeah, and again, not that we are gonna have like multiple versions of Chile and then it's gonna be messy, but at the same time, how these organizations can facilitate the space for people to have those conversations and then work from there.
If I may add to what you're saying, it sounds like it's voices and values, right? Being able to capture the values and the different voices of all of the people who are involved and then being able to present that.
Right.
I think that's
Yeah.
great, yeah.
We're good? Any more questions? I think on that note, we can end it. Please help me.